As scientists around the world study historic and prehistoric cultural resources, they unlock information that helps us better understand our past. Unfortunately, in Clark County, our cultural resources are disappearing faster than the scientists can study them. And if we don't do something to stop the loss of our cultural resources, we may lose the key to understanding those who came before us. The question is, how do we protect the cultural resources here in Clark County? Well, the first thing we can do is learn how to recognize them. To learn about the people who came before us, we come to museums like the Lost City Museum here in Clark County. Over the years, scientists, known as archaeologists, study human history and prehistory by excavating places where humans once lived. The reason we're visiting the Lost City Museum is because, unlike other museums that simply display history, this museum is located on a historic site.
This is one of the actual site locations, and it was excavated in the 1930s, and then in the 1980s they built this wing of the museum over it. And it allows us an excellent opportunity to sort of show the process of archaeology and the interpretation that comes at the end of our discovery.
And this area here is reconstructed to look like the original foundation.
This is the interpretation. After the archaeology is done, we go through analysis of artifacts, and then the final step is this interpretation of the best idea that we can come up with as to what this might have been like when the people were living here 1,000 years ago.
And you've recreated it faithfully, like there was probably a ring under there that led you to believe that that was a fire circle.
Hearths are usually in this area, have a little clay rim. It's reddened underneath because of the fire, and that's maybe what they were looking like.
And then right over here, you have the actual dig still left over.
This is where the archaeologist would finish the excavation. Everything is cleaned, the artifacts are collected, it's swept away, and this is pretty much the end of an excavation right here.
This isn't what we would see were we just going out in the desert.
No, you wouldn't see this.
And over here, we have basically what the archaeologists would have seen when they first came upon the site.
This is what the archaeologist looks for, and what we're looking at here are a few artifacts in the sand. You might not see very much, but bits of pottery, chipstone, and those kind of items give us a clue that there might be something a little more here.
So as we travel through the desert, we're looking for this. We're trying not to disturb areas like this for fear that we will disturb what could eventually be another archaeological find.
Yeah, the first clue that you might see are a few pieces of pottery, and if you recognize those, then you need to start being very careful about where you're stepping and look for other things. The point is that everything in place tells us a story, and everything disturbed is information lost.
In order to recognize pieces of pottery, it helps to know what the original pottery looked like. Here at the Lost City Museum, you'll get a chance to recognize not just pottery shards, but actual pottery found here in Clark County.
These are some of the different types of pottery that we might see out on a site. Most of what we'll see will be little tiny pieces. These are some pretty good sized pieces that give us an idea of the decoration and the color of the pottery. Very rarely do we ever, even in excavation, find a whole pot now. Most of that day is gone, but it's really exciting to be in the museum and be able to see the whole vessel.
There are some things you might see. You've actually got a mano and a metate down here.
We might be able to see a little bit of this ground stone, a mano or metate, or a fragment of that. These are not quite as portable as pottery sherds, and people tend to leave them.
So what we're seeing inside the museum is collected in the area, brought here only because it was part of an archaeological dig. Otherwise, everything would be left where it is.
Even as an archaeologist, if I'm not working on a project, I leave the artifacts where they are, because where they are later on in the excavation tells a lot about the site itself. So if it's not part of my project, it stays where it is.
The archaeological site preserved inside the museum is only a portion of the ancient site that covers the better part of the museum property. Outside, we have an opportunity to see what an archaeologist would find were they to dig under the sand here and other places in the area. Now, if you dig under the sand that we saw in there, basically this is what you would find, right?
Right. These are the foundations as exposed, and this is pretty typical of probably a later era Pueblo house unit. So you never know, though, what's under the sand until you actually start to work with the artifacts and actually expose the foundations and the floors of these houses.
So this actually, this is not a recreation. This is actually a foundation you excavated right on this site here.
This was actually excavated very early, but it is an actual foundation, and much like this, it's what we see when we first discover a site. You clear away the sand, you don't always know what you're going to find under it. You have an idea from the artifacts and the things that you're seeing. But until you get down and actually expose the walls and the floors, and then you get a sense of how the people were solving their problems, what they were doing here.
And of course, you're an interpretive museum, so you've taken this basis and you've recreated the pueblos that actually would be on this site.
Right. As good as we think, a lot of the archaeologists, when they see things, the interpretation, we do have to use a little bit of our imagination. Of course, there are no standing pueblos left. These were made of stone and mud, and through the hundreds and thousands of years, they melted away. So mostly what we find here are just these foundations and sometimes pieces of low walls. These were actually built by the Civilian Conservation Corps in 1935 as a part of the interpretation of the excavations they were doing then. So they were looking at what they were finding and then recreated these in what they thought these pueblos would have looked like. So it's kind of exciting to stand here and look out across the same scene that people were looking at maybe 1,000 years ago.
And the attention to detail is quite good. Inside, we actually see what they would have looked like inside. And don't you even have a wall that's kind of partially revealed?
Right, and you'll be able to see that. You can see how the sticks were laying down and the stone and the mud. It's really kind of an intriguing building process, and if you think about getting the materials and bringing them here, they had to have water, so that came from the valley floor. It was a bit of a process.
The recreation is absolutely spectacular. I mean, inside, outside, they've done a great job, but we're not going to expect to see this out in the wild.
No.
There's nothing like this.
No. What we'll see are usually just rock alignments, things that sort of line up that don't line up like that in nature. So that's really the first clue that you have a house foundation or some sort of a structure.
Not far from the museum, there's a street corner where we found rocks outlining an old structure. In this case, it was an old Mormon fort built on top of an ancient Pueblo site.
The people that built these houses, they built them in squares, and so it's a little easier for us to imagine these than it is some of the older Pueblo sites that we're not used to looking at. So this is like Grandma's house foundation.
Yeah, I actually can see mortar in between the stones here on the foundation. This literally looks like the beginning of a wall.
Correct. With these houses, they put down a stone foundation, and if you look, you can actually in some places see adobe brick that was laid on top. And that was the primary building material. It was the primary building material 100 years ago and also 1,000 years ago.
And this takes over this entire lot here. We see it everywhere.
Well, it actually takes over this lot and then goes on across the road there and continues out in that area over there. So it's a factor of use and reuse through time.
Right across the street from the remnants of the Mormon fort, we found another site, the site of a prehistoric pueblo.
When you're out and about, you may see things that you think could be a site. With this one, we have the excavation stakes left.
What is the etiquette involved when you find places like this?
It's really best just to leave it as undisturbed as you found it. There are other clues to sites that maybe you don't see all the time. Some sites have artifacts and some have partial foundations. These have been cleaned away a little bit, so they're a little easier to see. But the main point is that any damage that occurs to this takes away information. And once we lose that information, we may never know what happens.
And it's important that it remain in place, because as future archaeologists come here and try to excavate, it's also a matter of placement, not a matter just of the artifact itself.
Where you find something is as important or even more important than the object itself. An archaeologist can tell by where the artifacts lay, maybe the activities that occurred at that site. That's really important to help us understand the past. They're really beautiful things, but they have to stay right where they were left by the people that left them there. Sometimes you don't see these things, they're not quite all that obvious, but you have to be really careful about where you're walking, because we don't want to walk across this foundation. It could damage it, and then we've lost information.
And it's important that we stay off things like this. Unfortunately, it's not uncommon for vehicles even to roll over this because they just don't pay attention.
It's sad but true, and a lot of times people just don't realize what's there.
The foundation of this ancient pueblo has fared much better than another site in town. On a vacant lot within a stone's throw of someone's house lies what may be the last remnants of a civilization that could be lost to us forever if we don't do something to preserve it.
This is an area that actually shows some really sad things, but we're fortunate enough to be able to see some of the artifacts left here. People didn't recognize what was here, and they cut a road right through this site. But if you look closely, you can see the signs that this was an area that people were living and doing things, and there are artifacts still left here.
And unlike the last place we were at, in this final place we're visiting today, here we're actually getting to see pottery shard that really is identifiable as exactly that, pottery shards.
That's right. Archaeologists can recognize these things because you train your eye for it. But the layperson that comes out, or the person that's just taking a casual stroll, wouldn't always recognize things as artifacts. But if you look at this one right here, I think you can pretty well recognize that.
Yeah.
That's probably the base portion of a coiled pot. That's how they made their pottery, by coiling the clay. And this is evidence of people here 1,000 years ago.
And we can see there's not just one little piece, there's actually pieces of a pot that are still left there.
There are 3 or 4 or 5 pieces, I think, of the same pot, and then a few broken pieces of other pottery. It looks a little different, but it's all from pretty much the same time frame.
The philosopher George Santayana once wrote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." But how do we remember a past that we barely understand? Yes, scientists have learned a lot about the prehistoric cultures that lived here in Clark County, but there's much more to learn. And with new technology right around the corner, who knows what we'll learn from a tiny piece of pottery buried just beneath the surface of the sand. That's why it's important that we respect, protect, and enjoy the cultural resources of Clark County.